Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer Fantasy lore, where today we are going to talk about the Knights Panther. This is one of the many knightly orders of the Empire, which are broadly divided into secular orders, to which the Knights Panthers belong, and Templar orders, that pledge themselves specifically to one of the gods of the Empire. Deities like Ulrich, or other minor local deities. Indeed, the Knights Panther have a bit of a stormy history with the White Wolves, the Templars of Ulrich, but we'll get to that a little bit later. The Knights Panther, along with many other military orders of knights, were formed during the Great Crusade against Araby. This conflict was a massive military expedition by the unified forces of Bretonnia and the Empire, launched into the distant southern lands of Astalia to drive out the Arabian invaders under the command of the evil Sultan Jafar. Under his highly unnatural leadership, as Jafar himself was a sorcerer of significant power, Araby had launched repeated invasions of the Old World, leading to the conquest of Astalia and eventually the siege of the Chilean city Tobaro. It was this latest act of aggression that finally led the primary powers of the Old World to decide that enough was enough. The Great Crusade, launched in 1448, was intended to put down the Sultan for good. And the Crusader host, led by the King of Bretonnia, Louis the Righteous, met with significant success in the field against Sultan Jafar's hordes, defeating the invading enemy in the lands of Astalia and Tilea, crushing the Arabian invasion of the Old World. But whilst that was enough for many more, knights of the Empire amongst them chose to continue the pursuit of the Sultan's defeated forces, far beyond the lands they were originally sent to liberate, all the way down south into Araby itself. Many great and famous battles were fought in that far-distant land, but the campaign largely culminated with the assault upon one of Araby's largest cities, El Haik, where Jafar and the remnants of his army, including his personal guard, made their final stand against the Crusaders, and were broken apart beneath the shields, lances, and bardings of Bretonnian and Imperial knights alike. The Sultan's personal honor guard made a desperate last stand in and around his palace, before being defeated, opening the way for the Crusaders to chase down the scattered remnants of the Sultan's armies, including Jafar himself, who was killed by a lance thrust during the hurried retreat. But even then, the crusade was not over for everyone. Whilst the majority of the crusading forces would return to the Old World, many groups of knights would pursue the scattered army to make sure that it could never reorganize again. Amongst them, many knights of the Empire, pursuing their enemies into the inhospitable Atalan Mountains, as the enemy hoped to seek refuge amongst its peaks and inside the countless strips of jungles slithering and snaking around the tall mountains. It was in this area that the Knights Panther would solidify their name and identity, as the columns of knights and soldiers were constantly attacked by various monstrous creatures, including huge predatory cats. And it became a mark of honor and distinguishment to defeat one of these creatures in single combat, claiming its skull and pelt as a symbol of the accomplishment. But countless fanciful creatures and their hides were not the only souvenirs that the knights would bring back home to the Empire. Oh no. The Crusade had afforded the knights many opportunities to take other souvenirs, to enrich themselves on the basis of the local culture. And chasing down the remnants of the fleeing army had afforded them yet further opportunities to take advantages of the locals' rich hospitality. And the knights would return back home very, very wealthy indeed. And the chosen elites, those that had managed to slay the ferocious animals, all banded together to officially form the Knights of the Panther. Now, there was some initial hesitation to this within the Empire. The various knightly orders at the time were primarily Templars, or those with already established histories within the Empire. The clerical class were not overly fond of the idea of creating these, in essence, private armies across the Empire who would not be bound to their own command structure or the moral compass of a deity. But wealth opens many doors, and the Knights Panther were the wealthiest of all the groups returning from Araby. They quite quickly bought the favor of a plentiful number of elected counts to guarantee that there would be no proper political opposition against them establishing a secular military order. The only choice remaining, then, was where to fully establish this new knightly order. The initial choice fell on the city of Middenheim, as the Todbringer family, even before they arose to the position of electors in Middenland, had been staunch allies of the knightly order. However, Middenheim, of course, is also the principal seat of the Knights of the White Wolf, and considering the friction between the new knightly orders and the Templar orders, this plan was put out to pasture for the time being. The Knights Panther would still be allowed to maintain an active presence in Middenheim and Middenland in general, but their chapter house, their first and foremost fortress, would be moved to the city of Karaberg instead. This was a wise and very politically savvy move, as whilst the Knights of the Panther would not be allowed the prestige obviously inherent in being housed in the capital city of Midland, they would instead be granted a new fortress next to Karaberg, which had itself once been a provincial capital of what was then the province of the Drakwold before its eventual dissolution. This demonstrated that Midland valued the Knights Panther and wanted them to be honoured and granted plentiful prestige, even indeed to the point of offering them shared patrolling rights around Midland with the Knights of the White Wolf. That, no doubt, pissed off the Ulrich quite considerably, but considering the massive coffers that the Knights Panther brought with them, he was no doubt silenced within too long. And it's not like the Knights Panther would be layabout wastrels either. No privately funded knight order for the spoiled rich third sons of nobility. It was a true martial order that would bring with it not just wealth and prestige, but power to Midland as well. And they would engage in several important conflicts throughout the history of the Imperium, providing powerful knights to the Emperor's armies and those of the Elector Count of Midland, with certain prominent members of the Order securing places for themselves within the history of the Empire, such as Grandmaster Werner von Kriegstadt. who not only led the Empire's response against Warg Azag, but also slew the mighty green-skinned warlord during the Battle of Osterwald by running his lance through the creature's ribcage, finally bringing to an end a campaign of misery and murder that had ravaged the Empire for far too long. Although some might whisper that the Grandmaster had some help in the task. The Knights Panthers have also been an active participant in purging the Empire of its various unfortunate occupants, various chaos cults or beastmen infestations that plague the Empire on a near constant basis, as the Knight Panthers themselves have a rather interesting approach to the Empire, which they hold up as an obvious a priori good, and one that they wish to maintain at any cost. They are, in essence, imperial purists, and oppose, obviously, the forces of chaos with tremendous vigor, but they also oppose political and religious division within the Empire itself. Rather uniquely amongst the various secular orders, they are quite choosy when it comes to the candidates they take up, refusing to take any applicants who have a strong and stated preference for any single elector count, or even any single deity, as the Knight Panthers wish to be a genuine power for the unity of the Empire, rather than just another tool of political intrigue like far too many military orders within the Empire. This, no doubt, also stems from the initial concerns during their founding period. With all of these new knightly houses returning to the Empire flush with wealth, there were no doubt many who had plots and ideas beyond their station, and so as to reassure the established nobility, the electors, and the emperors who had ruled throughout the years since, that the Knights Panther did not intend to upset the apple cart. They made it very clear that they would take no active part in politics, or be any one elector's private army, with the potential exception of the Elector Count of Middenheim, that is, with whom they have always had a long and special relationship. To yet further this position as a neutral order within the Empire, the Knights Panther also take up a large number of squires and knightly candidates, many of whom are never intended to become full members of the order, but for a noble family it is of course a point of significant prestige and bragging rights to have a son squire for the Knights Panther. This, in essence, makes him an honorary member, and it is something that many of them can take with them for their careers in imperial society. Although even then the selection method are still somewhat stringent, and the candidate must promise to not have any firm convictions of a political nature during the period they will serve as squires for the Knights Panther. If, however, a squire is thought of as a potential candidate, he will be informed when the time is right that he is expected to go forth from whatever chapter house in which he resides, as the Knights Panther have chapter houses in every major electorate within the Empire, and go and find himself a trophy. A great and powerful, beautiful, noble beast that he must slay in single combat, skin, and have integrated into his saddle. Many full knights also take up the visage of the creature as a motif for their shields or helmet, carrying stylized versions of great predatory cats on top of their helmets. Although in recent years, a more bestial appearance has been preferred. Because, well, the Knights Panther have indeed fought actively against the forces of chaos throughout the Empire, even participating in the great wars against chaos as well. And, of course, we subscribe to the old canon here, that there was never any end times. And the Knights Panther delivered multiple ringing blows to the hordes of the Ever-Chosen, destroying an entire army of Chaos invaders as they were making their way through the narrow passages of the Middle Mountains. Their massed armored horsemen riding down the ranks of Chaos worshippers, breaking them apart and cutting them down with swords and piercing them with lances. During the Ever-Chosen's siege on Middenheim, the Knights Panthers defended the city's walls, and eventually sallied out to join the final conflict up upon the fields outside the city, contributing mightily to the fortified metropolis's survival. As the Knight Panthers have of course perfected the super heavy cavalry tactics for which the Empire is so rightly famed. They are amongst the most disciplined of all the knightly orders, forming themselves up into dedicated squadrons, each with their own history, heraldry, and occasionally even battle tactics, mounted upon destriers of Arabian descent, some of the finest war horses in the entire Empire, and due to their wealth and prestige, they are clad in the finest armor that the Empire's smiths can possibly produce as well. They are true heavy cavalry, lancing into the enemy in a solid mass of armored horse flesh, crushing their ranks, often routing enemies before they even make impact. But if they do, the Knights Panther also have all the sticking power in the world, more than willing to toss aside shattered lances and continue to fight with heavy swords. And protected by both skill and heavy armor plating, there are very few foes who can resist them in an extended melee. And that is quite possibly why the great enemy sought other ways to deal with the Knights Panther. For despite hundreds of years of honorable, proper, and genuinely excellent service, the Knights Panther did suffer an enormous scandal as well. In the early years of 2500 in the imperial calendar, it was revealed that the Knights Panther had been housing a significant chaos cult within its own ranks, dedicated to the blood god Khorne, who had taken their noble vows and twisted them. Instead of dedicating themselves to protecting the Empire and its unity, they had instead grown insular, focusing on their own protections and their own advantages, introducing a deep moral rot into the knightly order, which also saw many of its more prominent and promising squires wasted in pointless massacres ordered by these chaos-corrupted knights, who vowed that they would sacrifice their lessers before themselves. A clear and blatant deviation upon the usual Khornian creed, suggesting that the purpose of the infiltration was to weaken the knights, specifically by depriving it of new and promising members. The heresy, however, was uncovered, and those who were a part of it scattered and fled quickly. This, however, was still obviously an enormous stain on the honor of the Knights Panther, who then had to suffer underneath the scrutiny of witch hunters who would go through the order to make sure that there were no more taint within their ranks. A full purge of the knightly order, however, was not possible, for multiple reasons. One was, of course, the seniority and the prestige of the Knights Panther. Purging them would be a major blow to the Empire, and a huge admission that even the most noble and established orders could be corrupted. It would bring into question the honor of every knight in the Empire. And, again, the Knights Panther had chapter houses in every single electoral province. They were a huge and well-organized knightly order. If pushed into a corner, well, that could cause a hell of a lot more problems than a few dozen rogue knights lurking through the woods. And so whilst the order would be scrutinized closely, and it would continue to be kept under close observation for the predictable future, it would be allowed to continue to exist and elect a new Grand Master, as obviously the sitting Grand Master had to exit his role in disgrace. The new Grand Master was Heinrich von Torlichhalm. He was specifically chosen for his diplomatic nature and his close connections with the Knights of the White Wolf, and thus the cult of Ulrich. He was expected to be both a zealous and honestly religious individual, breaking with some of the Knights' previous code, but considering the circumstances, that was obviously necessary. And he was also expected to be more than eager to purge the ranks of the Knights Panther, of anyone hesitating to remain adequately devout. It was also under his rule that the headpieces began to change as well. Previously, the Knights Panther had near universally borne the visage of whatever creature they had slain, usually some huge and intimidating cat creature, either as crests or indeed as armored visages, or occasionally even the entire pelt and head of the creature, their skulls, which is indeed a bit of an unfortunate connection, considering the nature of the group that infiltrated them. Instead, now, the knights would be encouraged to wear the visage of bestial beastmen creatures, to demonstrate their rejection of the creatures of chaos, and to show that the Knights Panther had faced their inner demons, rejected them, and beheaded them. However, many of the other knightly traditions would of course be maintained. The requirements to seek out a mighty creature would continue, as would the tradition of integrating its pelt into the saddle. And so the Knights Panther, despite a rather complicated backstory, remain even to this day, as Warhammer never ended, one of the most respected, even if that has taken a blow recently, and largest knightly orders within the Empire. And although their recruitment numbers have certainly been dropping as of late due to the controversies surrounding them, they will no doubt make a bold recovery underneath the stern leadership of their new Grand Master. Until next time, then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again very soon. Have a good day.